During World War I, a new, brutal kind of fighting took over the battlefield, one that would define the war for millions of soldiers. Today, we're going to take a look at what life was really like inside the trenches of the Western Front. Okay, so let's just think about this. Imagine a battlefield that's hundreds of miles long, where no matter how many huge attacks are launched, neither side can really move forward. This was the stalemate on the Western Front. So what do you do when going over the top just means you won't come back? The answer was to go down. Soldiers on both sides started digging into the earth, creating this huge, unbelievably complex network of ditches. And these ditches became their home, their fortress, and in a lot of ways, their prison. This was the start of trench warfare. So first up, let's explore what this world of trenches was actually like. Because these weren't just simple ditches in the ground. They were carefully engineered battlefields designed for a whole new kind of war. Yeah, we're not talking about a few scattered holes here. The Western Front was an almost continuous line of trenches that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of miles across Belgium and France. With both sides dug in and protected by machine guns and artillery, progress wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in inches. And it wasn't just a single line either. The trench system was complex, with layers of defense. You had the frontline trench, which, as you can guess, faced the enemy and was the most dangerous place to be. Behind that was the support trench, a fallback position, and even further back was the reserve trench, where troops could get a bit of rest. And then, connecting them all, were the communication trenches, which let soldiers and supplies move around with at least some cover. You know, they were actually pretty cleverly designed for survival. Trenches were built in a zigzag pattern. Why? Well, so if a shell exploded in one part, the blast wouldn't just travel in a straight line down the whole trench. The top was built up with sandbags. They were called parapets. And on the bottom, they laid down wooden slats or duckboards to try and keep soldiers' feet out of the endless mud. And for shelter from the constant shelling, they'd carve out little caves called dugouts into the walls. But even the smartest design couldn't protect the soldiers from everything. The enemy wasn't just the army on the other side of no man's land. Soldiers also had to fight a daily battle against their own environment. And the conditions were just awful. I mean, truly terrible. Rain would turn the clay soil into this thick, disgusting mud that could literally suck the boots right off your feet. Trenches would flood for days on end, which meant soldiers were constantly cold, constantly wet, and just miserable. And all that constant wetness led to this horrific condition they called trench foot. I want you to imagine your feet being stuck in cold, muddy water for days. They'd swell up, the skin would start to rot, and if it got infected, which it often did, the only solution was sometimes amputation. It was a serious, constant threat. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, the soldiers weren't alone. The trenches were infested. Rats grew to be enormous, feeding on food scraps, and they were a constant, disgusting presence. Then there were the lice. Tiny insects that lived in the seams of their uniforms, causing this unbearable itching and spreading a sickness called trench fever. And in the summer, you'd have swarms of flies, spreading even more diseases. So how did anyone cope with all of this chaos and horror? How did they stay sane? Well, the answer was a strict, predictable routine. Let's take a look at the daily grind of a soldier. A soldier's day was incredibly structured. It always began and ended with something called the stand-to. That's where every man would stand on the firing step, weapons ready, watching for an attack at dawn or dusk, since that's when visibility was poor. The daytime was for chores, like cleaning your rifle. But the real work, like repairing defenses, bringing up supplies, or going out on patrol, that all happened under the cover of darkness. And the food? Yeah, that was just as bleak as the environment. It was basic when it was monotonous. The staples were tinned meat, called bully beef, and these incredibly hard crackers known as pilot biscuits. Fresh food was a luxury they could only dream about. Even the water often tasted of the chemicals they had to use to make it safe to drink. But in a world of mud, boredom, and fear, it was the small things that made a huge difference. And maybe the most important thing of all was mail. Getting a letter from home was like a lifeline. It was a connection to a normal world, and it was a massive boost to morale, something real to hold on to. So this daily grind, it provided some structure, right? A small feeling of safety in all the chaos. But the war was always waiting, and the most dangerous moments were when soldiers had to face it head on. And this brings us to our final section, the fear, the constant noise, and the deep, invisible wounds left by this new kind of warfare. Just look at this number. Over 70% of all soldiers killed or wounded were hit by artillery. Think about that. The biggest danger wasn't an enemy soldier you could see. It was a massive shell fired from a huge gun miles away that you would never even hear coming. And the sound? It was terrifying. Soldiers described it as this constant, deafening roar, an endless whistle of incoming shells, followed by a crash that would literally shake the earth. A bombardment like this could go on for days, creating an unbelievable amount of physical and mental pressure. The human mind just wasn't built for that. Many soldiers suffered from a condition we now call PTSD, but back then it was known as shell shock. The constant terror and noise caused this deep psychological trauma. The symptoms could be anything from uncontrollable shaking to the complete loss of speech. It was an invisible wound, and at the time, it was tragically misunderstood. So for the millions who served in the trenches, the war didn't just end when they went home. It left behind these deep scars. Some you could see, sure, but many that you couldn't. These were wounds to the mind and to the spirit. And that leaves us with a final, really powerful question. For a whole generation of soldiers who lived through the unimaginable world of the trenches, the greatest battle often began after the war was already over. How do you recover from a war that you carry inside of you?